So, Joe, Mike, thank you. Welcome. Thanks very much for doing this.
Yes.
This conversation can go in whatever direction you want it to, but let's begin by approaching the topic of the talk, really, the title of it, and that's landscape. So, for you too, and we'll take it from Mike first and then Joe, what is the importance of landscape, first of all, to photographers, but also to the greater population? Mike.
Well, thank you, Gary, and thank you, Joe, for the chance to be here with both of you this evening. It's a great honor to share a stage with both of you, and I've been looking forward to this for some time. And thanks to all of you as well for joining in this evening as well. I'm sure if you have any questions or comments, we'd love to see those in the chat or something. But landscape photography to me, the landscape has. And thank you, Gary, for asking me to go first, because I would hate to come after Joe on this particular question and many others. But it's unique to each of us, really. And we're all a product of the environment in which we grew up. And, I grew up in a family who had a lot of very strong connections to nature and exploring and traveling and this sort of thing. And, then I sort of, became familiar with other nature photographers, Galen Rowell, Ansel Adams, and the whole lineage there. And it's really, to me, it's and this is something I remember Joe talking about at some point, is it's this connection to the wild in nature, I think, that really resonates with people. And when I'm able to share a vision of nature or a vision of the natural world that portrays that untamed wildness that people can connect to, and to me be reassured by, that it's still there, that there's still this natural rawness to the world. And even if we can't, even if we're fortunate enough to have a day job or a life indoors where we can sleep indoors, it's still out there. And I work a lot in night photography, and I extend that to the night sky and the universe and stuff. But this connection to the natural world, and it's its moments of perfectness are very important. But I think, to me, one of the most important things that landscapes are for me and for perhaps others is this connection to the natural world.
Well, that's fantastic. Thanks, thanks, Mike, and thanks to Gary for asking us to partake in this conversation this evening. I mean, I think you hit the nail on the head. I mean, there's so much to this topic. But fundamentally at the heart of it is, what does it mean? What does it mean to be human, and how do we relate to life itself? And the landscape forms the backdrop for that experience. And I think it is neglected, or it has been in actually through human culture to some extent. Maybe because our ancestors were so deeply connected to it, in the midst of time, and through the course of the kind of cultural evolution, we've seen that the tendency for human beings to seek comfort, reassurance, and the conservation of energy, I've once heard it described as, i.e., we like to be lazy. It has led us almost in some ways, without us realizing it, to this very comfortable existence where we can isolate ourselves from the rain, from the wind, from the snow and the cold and the heat, even almost anywhere we are on the planet. And so we're incredibly adaptable, but we are paying a huge price for that, which is disconnect, isn't it? Disconnection from nature. So I think that landscape photography for many of us is our first route back into rediscovering our sense of the world, not just the world, but of nature. And then the more we grow to it, then I think the wild world and wilderness. And in the UK, we do struggle a little bit with that, because there's really no technical wilderness apart from fragmentary ecosystems on the coast and tops of mountains. In the United States, you're still lucky enough to be able to experience real wilderness, which is, to my mind, is my kind of highest sort of spiritual experience, the sublime of nature. And yes, and it's something that I strive. I'd love to be able to experience wilderness once a year, because it feeds me and reconnects me to life. So yeah, I think on some level, although there's so many aspects to it, including our personal identities and histories and so on a fundamental level, yeah, it's about life itself and realizing that we are dependent on it, and landscape forms the backdrop for that. And I think that the camera, because we're all photographers, we use our eyes as our primary sense for having a creative relationship with nature.
You know, it's so interesting when hearing your comments there, because it brings to mind, there was a recent book, or I think it was a book or an ebook, and the basic gist of it was that it takes, if you're able to get back into a wilderness environment, like a real wilderness environment, let's say by yourself, or you're away from roads, cell phone reception, all of that, it takes about 3 days to sort of, I don't know if you ever really asymptote into a wilderness experience, but I think it was called like the 3-day effect, or the 4-day effect, or something like that. But it takes some period of time to kind of, give up those, I won't say unnatural, but let's say human imposed civilized cycles of life, and to ease back into a natural cycle of life where you're just worried about, food and water and shelter and staying warm and all those other things. And it's fascinating that it takes that amount of time, but that you can do it. And the landscape is just such a big part of that, whether it's if you're in a desert landscape and you do most of your stuff at night and you try to just stay put during the day, or if you're in an Arctic, frozen landscape where you're you're just trying to stay alive, or if you're somewhere in the Mediterranean and you're just living a good life. I mean, there's just so many different ways that the natural world, shapes our interpretation of, like you say, that human existence. And along those lines, it's fascinating too when you think about like the group that's here, like all of you who are with us this afternoon. If we were all to go into a fairly well-stocked restaurant and order, I don't know, lunch, let's say, or dinner, we'd probably all get something different, and it's just a reflection of our unique personalities and our characteristics. I've often wondered, if you're at a supermarket checking out, how, if ever, two people come through with the identical cartload of stuff, how long would you have to wait for that to happen? And it's like that whenever we're on photography workshops and stuff, and we're all at the same place at the same time shooting the same thing with more or less the same lens, and everyone comes back with something that in some cases is completely different. And I love that. I get so inspired by that, because it's one of the things I love the most about teaching is the inspiration that I get to experience from viewing this scene through your eyes. And it just never ever gets old. But there's so many different aspects to it.
Well, that's interesting, because if you think of the different perspectives, one of the great things about landscape photography, if you were to compare it with other genres, is it's a kind of 360-degree field of view. Whereas with, say, if you're in a genre of wildlife photography, and I spend a lot of time with wildlife photographers, it's very objective. So there's usually an object. It might be a polar bear, it might be a penguin, or it might be a bird in flight, let's say. But most people have the same objective, to try and get a sharp picture of it, and usually filling the frame. So creatively, there's a kind of, as in a funny kind of way, it doesn't have to be this way, but that's the way the culture's kind of developed. And I think we're very fortunate in landscape, in that it should be the case that we respond to what we see and we learn to translate it in our own unique way. And that, I think, does bring out that exactly what you're saying. There's no two supermarket trolleys are the same. Nobody chooses the same thing on the menu. Well, some do, but that's usually because there's a limited range. So I think that is great. And I mean, literally on workshops, I find some people are pointing their lenses at the ground, some people are pointing them up at the canopy of the trees, some people are pointing north, some are south, and so on, depending on the type of environment that you're in, because we respond to different things. And actually, the beauty of that is, I think, ultimately what every artist, and by that I mean every human being and certainly every human being who uses a camera and wants to express themselves, they're bringing their life experience. They might not do it consciously, but it's everything they learned as a child, at teenage years, in the 20s, in formal education or whatever, and since then. and it's a subtle, it's incredibly complex process that you can't measure. So it brings with it pain and joy, suffering and anguish, personal history, and all of that, as well as lots of cultural references, a sense of what they might have learned from other art forms, and even their ideas about their own body and how that works. And it's just a fascinating amalgam in that sense of that landscape photography can truly reflect who you are as a person. It's just that you might have to sort of interrogate it to get to that point. But that's what brings out the beauty that's out there, I think, is partly the filter of an individual vision, and how to realize that it is about you. It's a very in that sense, very self-indulgent. But I think that self-indulgence is the right thing as an artist, because that is what actually connects to the human and to the universal.
Yeah, I love that example, because when you talk about the contrast between, I have never been a successful wildlife photographer because I have zero patience, basically. And I'm like a little mosquito that jumps around, and my attention span is very short. But, I love that comparison. I never really thought about that like that before. And you're right. It is kind of a very, objective, focused, goal-driven form of photography. I hope I'm not offending anybody here. But, there's a couple of things that come to mind there. One of which is that, as I think, to me, one of the satisfactions that come about during the process of doing landscape photography or night photography is this process of, chipping away at it. And, it's, so often, people will, on a workshop, I often go back to the same place 2 or 3 nights in a row. And people are like, well, why are we doing that? We've already been here, and it's just, you just get so much more insight, and your stress level goes down and comfort goes up when you're visiting a place and you're just slowly, slightly changing, in and out the composition. It's like a sculpture in a way. You're just chipping away pieces of it. And eventually there'll be this moment where it's like, okay, I knew that was in there, but I just had to kind of get to it. And there's this, I don't know if this is true or not, but there's a, and maybe this was with you, Joe, but there was this famous landscape photographer was asked, like, well, how do you take such great sunrise shots or something like that? And the answer is, well, you keep coming here every, month for about 20 years. And it's kind of like this story about how this American tour, I can say this because I'm, American, obviously, but this American tourist goes to visit, one of the colleges at Oxford, and says, says the groundskeeper, my good fellow, how do you keep such manicured lawns? And he was like, well, it's really quite simple, madam. You simply, please, I hope I'm not offending anybody either. You simply mow them twice a week for about 800 years. And, it's like, so the point is you just can't go to a place, plant your tripod, take a picture and expect it to be a trophy. It takes, and to me, that's part of the fun of the pursuit, is the process of, capturing or creating or making an image that really connects, your own, experience and with the scene, with the, we look at Joe's work, and he's clearly just so familiar with the natural landscape, and the seasons and the cycles and the time of day and the play of the light, and it really shows. I mean, it's like, that's the sort of thing that you could just show up and capture it by winning the lottery, but most people aren't that lucky. So there's just so many things that go on there.
That's true, and I mean, it's also true. Most people, if they're not full-time photographers, they do maybe another job that they're really brilliant at and successful at. And I think one of the difficulties with photography generally is that because you can superficially produce really interesting pictures, and some of the time you can produce really good pictures quickly without a great deal of effort, but actually to do it consistently, and I think to develop a real joy for it, you have to do it a lot. And you can do that as a non-professional. You just need to put in the hours and the time. And that's why I think your point about not just scattering your energy all over the place, but actually to return to places, to get to know them really well, which is one of the great virtues of doing local work, is a really great thing to do, because that's how you learn about nature. most of all, and the way that, I mean, the cycles of the seasons, you know, what we can all obviously think about, but the character of light, the different weather conditions in particular, because there's always an interaction of all of those things together, and that makes landscape, every moment is unique, you know, so you can't repeat anything, you know, and that's kind of very, very cool, but it means if you have a moment where there's a kind of revelation, and that does happen occasionally, you want to be ready for it, and that comes from practice. And although I know that it's not the same, but there are, you know, think of most other activities which either have a creative or a process in them, be it a craft, you know, or an art form. Other artists describe it as practice. My painter friends also, they have a practice. You know, musician friends, they all do practice, whether it's on the keyboard or the guitar or whatever it may be, and you know, it's a form of meditation. And I think photography, because it's so very particular, doesn't lend itself to quite that application. You know, you have to go out with your camera, and every time it's different, but it is still practice. It's still practice. You set your tripod up, you set your camera up, or if you use a tripod, you know, and use the camera, and eventually you get to the point where the shutter speed, the ISO, the focus point, the aperture, those elements become instinctive, so that you don't waste brain power being absorbed by them. And that's really I mean, yes, of course, there's automated features in cameras which helps us to do that more easily. But you still need to understand, I think, the process in order to get the best and the most out of your photography. You know, whether, you know, however sophisticated the camera you're using, whether it's an old camera, a new camera, and so on. And then I think there is this other magical element, which not all of us do, and that is making prints, which actually adds another layer of depth, because the print is an additional, I mean, you can say, okay, well, I prepare my pictures for screen, which is very good, and requires lots of work as well. But when you translate it into a print, it turns it into something else, and that translation is really, really important. Sorry, I had to get that in there, because it's one of my little kind of what's the word? Well, I'm an advocate, let's say, for print, and I think also that anybody who wants their work to last, you know, you think about when you're gone, will people keep your hard drives lovingly and look at them? No, probably not. Well, they might, so they might open the images up on a screen, but I think what we all know works is print. So I'd really encourage everybody to print, even if you don't have your own printer. And landscape is a particularly wonderful way to, I think, print is a particularly wonderful way to record landscape photographs well. But yeah, there's so much around this subject, and Gary, you can probably tell that we would keep talking about it if you're happy for us to do so. I could easily run into identity and all that, but do you want to change the course of this at this stage?
No, keep going. Great as it is.
Oh, that's good. I'm trying to remember when you started off, Mike. There was a really, you know how it is in conversations. You think, oh, I must respond to that. It was a brilliant point, and there were so many. And I wish I could rewind, you know, back to that point now.
Yeah, I just actually stopped and took a couple of notes, because you made some excellent points I want to come back to. But go ahead.
Great stuff. Well, I think that. Well, I think I talked about personal history already, really, but I also wanted to bring up abstraction, which it might sound like a very, very irrelevant point, but in fact, there is a great history of landscape art and abstraction being very closely aligned. That might sound odd. What is abstraction? But you know, we know that 20th century painting is where the kind of idea of abstraction emerges, and as I went to art school and studied painting and was taught by some of the best abstract painters in the late 20th century in the UK, it's something I'm really, really interested in, because in some ways you can say that landscape itself is a form of abstraction. Why does this matter? Well, if you can see the world in terms of its abstract relationships, and something that I like to do a lot on workshops is when we do post-production is teach abstraction by first of all turning the image upside down, on the screen. This is something that painters have done in a different way by turning the paintings upside down, for generations. And once you start to see things as pure relationships, it improves your art, because you realize that underlying the pictorial world that you're looking at is a series of visual relationships. And to make good art, I mean, if you were to take Gary's Van Gogh and put it upside down, I mean, it would obviously look very different, and it would look upside down. But once you start then unpicking it, it becomes very satisfying purely as form, light, color, texture, and depth, and so on. And these are the things that we are fundamentally all dealing with. So learning to see in an abstract way is a really powerful way of improving your photography. And in some ways, the landscape itself is an abstraction. It's a background to the world, on which you could say, certainly wildlife photographer friends of mine have said to me, oh, you just paint the back, or sorry, you just photograph the background, because they're all looking at objects. So it brings us back to that point. What are we looking at? Are you looking at an object in the frame? In landscape, you're not. You're looking at relationships. And I did have one, I should just say that I worked in the States as an assistant for nearly 2 years in the 1980 and 81 and 82. And in 82, once I stopped assisting, I did a road trip and traveled across the United States with a friend of mine in a yellow Volkswagen Beetle. That was very much the kind of thing of the day. And we stopped at the Canyon de Chelly in, I think it's in Arizona, isn't it? Just in eastern Arizona, just west of New Mexico. And for folk who don't know the Canyon de Chelly, it's not the biggest canyon, it's not the deepest, it's not anything in particular, but for me, it was the most beautiful place I had ever been at the time. And what is it about it? It is like walking down into a living sculpture. So steep vertical sided rock walls, and these sandstone walls are a blend of incredibly smooth, painterly surfaces lined with desert varnish, glinting in the sun if the sun's on them, or they have a very different color when it's cloudy or in the shade. And it's like being in a living artwork. And that in that moment, I had this moment when I realized that, bearing in mind that I only just came out of university as an art student, that there's no way as an artist could ever match Mother Nature. And that was the moment I decided to be a photographer.
Wow.
Because I thought there are many worse ways of spending your life than observing the beauty of the world, and trying to translate it as a photograph. And that was that. So, I mean, sorry, that was very indulgent, but the point is,
great.
it felt, for me, it was a really special moment. And also it perhaps illustrates the sense of connection I have with the United States, because I will always be grateful for that. And I don't go that often, but I still do return to the desert Southwest, and I've been to Colorado a few times in recent years. And the scale of the landscape of the American continent is still incredibly inspiring, and it is very, very beautiful still. So and that's great. And you can still experience places that are truly wild, with wild animals that can kill you, and so on. So which we don't have, and that obviously adds a certain kind of frisson to the experience. So yeah, it's it truly wonderful. So for me, my identity as a photographer is deeply embedded in landscape, and also in some ways with American landscape.
Wow. I mean, that's just, I mean, please, I don't even know where to begin. There are so many parts of your comments there. I haven't been to Canyon de Chelly. I've heard of several, I've had many people describe this experience, and that's just, I haven't been there yet. I'm even more convinced to go. I guess the closest for me was that experience was in Yosemite National Park. I mean, it's just, it's not quite so compact, but I guess it's the three-dimensional nature feeling of the rock and the beauty of it. So something you mentioned I want to come back to is this abstraction and interpretation. And when you're in that canyon, and can you just say, at the moment you realize that path, one of the things, there's two things I'm going to try to see if I can somehow weave them together, or maybe do them in sequence. But the first of them is, and this is something that I've really come to appreciate from having the luxury of traveling and things, is this notion of, and I think I may have mentioned this during one of Gary's classes, is the real value of, like you said, Joe, your local environment. And I mean, this last year has been one in which I think many of us just wish we could be somewhere else. We wanted to travel. We felt frustrated we weren't allowed to travel. We couldn't travel. We're in lockdown. And along this last year, I had the great fortune of getting to know Gary and teaching some classes. And during one of the classes, many of the participants in the class were sharing some of their favorite places to shoot, and so many of which I'd never heard of these places in the UK. And I was like foaming I was like, please, can I just go and visit some of these cool places? And I think to the people who were bringing them up, they were almost, I won't say they were embarrassed or shy, but they're like, well, of course, there's this place down the road, or there's this place down the road. And they're like, well, everyone's been there. I mean, there's nothing special about that. And there's this great article, I think it was an Outdoor Photography magazine a few years ago, and I think I may have mentioned this during the class at the time. And the point of the article was the value of being a local hero and this local authority, because wherever any of us live, someone wants to visit. So I know people who want to come visit Minnesota, not that whole lot, but there are those out there. I can tell you there's many people who want to visit where you live in the UK, wherever it is. And, you live there, we all live in our locations, and there's nature that surrounds us. Before we got on, Joe was sharing a view out the window. I'd love to go visit that area. It's just so different from where, I live. And, it's that process of repetition and, getting to know a landscape and to know the cycles of nature. And I know it is where we are. It's where we, one of the points of the article is people have this notion, well, I have to travel to get good pictures. I have to go there to get good pictures and good photos, good images. I have to leave where I am and go someplace else to get good images. And, if you really, that mindset, and of course we can't, for all the different reasons, time, family, resources, global pandemic. And so if you just sort of just give that up and surrender to the notion that we're just going to really, there's a park nearby, and there's probably maybe, I don't know if in macro photography or miniature landscapes or something like this. Yeah. But there is that value in just that locality that you were talking about. I just wanted to come back to.
And it does tie in with the notion of abstraction, because you for sure, as soon as you mention macro or doing intimate landscapes, you're looking at little relationships of form and color, texture and light and so on. And of course you can make images like that in your back garden. So it can literally be as local as that. One of the things that I'm really interested in is the way that we do associate photography very strongly with travel on the whole. Especially in the UK, and I know quite a few participants on workshops who come along and they haven't used their cameras since the last time they were on a workshop with me. Which is always feels a bit sad, because I'm kind of wishing they would be inspired to go out with their cameras, but they're obviously happy to be there. It's more that actually to really get more from your photography, do you need to practice? And also, I think then I want to cultivate this sense of, by all means, travel to photograph, but also photograph close to home and learn to appreciate what you have in that way. I think too, there's bear with me, because this is a theory that I've wanted to share for a while. But my brother is a musician, so he's a professional oboist, and whenever we get together, we usually go out for a walk, and he's a very keen photographer too. So and we'll be talking about music and photography, and it's incredible how the language is all the same. I mean, I can never get over that. You would talk about color and tone, in sound, and the emotional pitch, resonance, So many of the ideas, flow, rhythm, and so on are the same. And so the thing that I find interesting is my brother Nick is especially, he's an oboist, but he can also play the flute and the clarinet and the cor anglais and the bassoon and the piano and the guitar. So he's a really good musician, but he has his special thing that he does, his oboe. And so you can look at that as a sort of practice. That's it. That's the core. But he also plays with this other stuff. And there are analogies in photography, and I'm going to come back to that in a second. He also has a core repertoire, which he's played ever since he was a young oboist, and he knows inside out and back to front. And then he'll play new pieces as well. So what he's doing in many ways is as an artist is he has his core, and then he travels out. And in many ways, I think as a photographer, if you think of what you do, your passion, your photography, as a local thing, where you get to know it incredibly well, and everything about the nature that surrounds you and how it changes with the seasons, and may change with climate change as well. That's another story. And it changes with the seasons, with the weather, and also you change with time. Perhaps your view, perspective on life, and the scenery in front of you. But you have an intimate relationship with it, and it's a deep relationship. But you can spread your wings and have a broad relationship with a much wider landscape, the landscape of our planet. Whether you travel to Yosemite, if you're British, that's a pretty spectacular, thing to do. Not so spectacular if you live in San Francisco, obviously. But it's to go to a world class. You think we are familiar, I think, in the UK with the sort of places that would be bucket list destinations. Yosemite is most definitely one of the top 5, along with Torres del Paine in Chile, probably, maybe the Karakoram, in Pakistan. Might be the Victoria Falls, or Guilin in China, or it might be somewhere in Australia, like the Olgas, or the people have their own views. But at any rate, these are all really, really outstanding and amazing places, which we'd probably all love to go and see if we could. But we're not going to do our best photography there, are we? We're just not, because we don't live there. We don't have that intimate relationship with it. But when we go, we want to be able to come back with something that we're happy with. We're much more likely to be happy with what we get if we know our local landscape inside out, so that we can play. We have that confidence in our technique through our understanding of Mother Nature, through our local experience. So in many ways, the analogy, I think, is that the world is the entire repertoire, and our local patch is our personal repertoire. So it's the pieces that we know really, really well, and that we continue to develop and refine over time, and that give us reassurance, and it's our comfort zone in some ways. But it also helps us to be a better artist, by really working on that. We're a couple of weeks ago, I got everybody in our group to go out and shoot pictures in the rain, which many of them did, and I know some of them are here tonight. So well done, guys, those of you who did. But I think that is a way that you extend you get out of your comfort zone, but you extend your range and your understanding of light and conditions by doing that. And you're much more likely to be able to do that locally. You've got to, if you take that risk. And you might find, well, you go out in the open moorland and it's virtually impossible to do a good picture in the rain. But guess what? If you go into the local woodland, you might come back with something wonderful, because that's how the light works in those conditions. And all the colors are rich and dripping wet, glistening with water and so on. And it can be very beautiful to see, I think. So, that's anyway, thank you for indulging my theory of breadth and depth, because that's what that was.
Well, I want to pick up on that, because that's really interesting. First, it reminds me about I think it was about 3 years ago, I was taking a group through Scotland on we planned to do night photography, and it's in Scotland. And so, we this group really, really wanted to do a Scottish, a trip in Scotland and night photography. So I obliged, and it, of course, was cloudy most of the time. So we did a lot of daytime stuff.
Surprise, surprise.
It was. I mean, so we went to Skye. We went to the Cairngorms, and my attitude was, look, it's raining. This is a chance to get Scotland in the rain. How great is this? And by about the third or fourth day of this, one of the people took me aside and said, Mike, we get it. Please, can we just stay inside for a little while? I remember there's one, we were walking through, maybe you've experienced this, but it was just one of those moments where you just know you're in this time and place. We were hiking through to this little lake in the Cairngorms. It was just a steady, slow rain, nothing major. And it was in mid-September. And these ferns had turned this incredible golden yellow color. And we hit this patch where it was just, as far as you could see, and there were these pines, and it was the rain. The colors were so rich, and there was some mist. And, they had to drag me away from there because I just knew that this was one of those, if we came back in a week, it wouldn't be the same. But I want to come back to your theory about, because I've had a similar thought. I come from a sort of science and mathematics type background, and so a lot of times I'm looking for, like, how does mathematics explain the world? How does it's like always amazing that you can know with great precision, if I launch something at this angle, the speed, exactly where it's going to land. Anyway, all that sort of stuff. But it occurs to me that if you think about the human senses, we have sight, smell, taste, hearing, and touch. And so what you just described was sight and hearing. So if you think of like photography, I'm not an art historian, so please forgive me, but I remember being in, I think it was the Louvre at one point, and there was these massive paintings that were basically black. And then there were these few little, patches of light where all the things were happening. And I was with a very close French friend of mine who knew the place well. And he spent like an hour on this one painting, just taking it apart. And my mind was blown completely because of all the, everything that was in it, and which makes sense because it's a huge painting in the Louvre. But it occurred to me that if you think about like a visual representation of a landscape, there's a lot of dark areas with a few light areas. And if you think about music, you have the bass, you have the which is the foundation, and then you have the oboe,
yes,
painting in the light spots.
Yeah.
And if you think about, like a meal, you have like the basic, something you taste. So you have the base
bread
foundation, but then you have these notes of things.
Yeah.
And I don't know if there's what's left, I guess, smell and hear. I don't know if there's a smell and hear and a touch equivalent, but it seems like there ought to be a mathematical relationship that says this part is the foundation. And then you have this term, which deals with the light high parts that are the parts that people notice against this back. You have a background and you have a thing. So I don't know, when you talked about that, I haven't really shared that in much detail before. It's kind of crazy, but I think there's something to this commonality of our sensory input as human beings, and then art or satisfying experiences, whether it's through a restaurant, maybe perfumes, or there's got to be, anyway. So I just wanted to share that with you because that's just one of my crazy.
I'm sure that the people who are expert on smells will have the equivalent for sure. Yeah. I mean, it's really interesting though, the site. So one of the things I wanted to discuss with you, if there's a way that we can head the story in that direction, really, is the science and art overlap. I mean, I mentioned before everybody joined us that my son's a scientist, and I have no scientific qualifications at all, but I'm as a human being, I'm really, really curious about science. I think it's if you can say such a thing, I see it as the greatest achievement of humankind. I suppose you could argue that it kind of breaks down the world into knowable pieces, and through mathematics is the great foundation in which things can be measured and understood in that way. And I find it remarkable because on the one hand, some people believe that's really reductionist and very depressing, and yet I see it as incredibly exciting, and it makes my imagination kind of go wow. So I know nothing really about astrophysics, but I'm always fascinated when the story's coming back from, the distant universe, from Hubble or from the Large Hadron Collider. Not distant, but what's happening is effectively something that's unknowable for us. Trying to recreate the conditions of the sun, center of the sun on Earth, to see what happens, and to see if we can discover new particles and all that sort of thing. And I mean, I think that to try to understand how the world actually works, to using these tools that we are developing, is just incredibly exciting. And I would love to see much more conversation and crossover between the arts on the one hand, where in some ways it's immeasurable, because it's kind of a matter of opinion. So academically, it's very difficult to evaluate art. It's notoriously so. And again, I know, well, if I take the example of my son, when he was doing his A-levels at school, so 16, 17, he was told, don't bother with art, nobody cares. It's like, he was a really good painter, and he said, do your maths, physics, chemistry, biology, and the world is your oyster, kind of thing. Well, that's what he did. But he's missed his art, doing his art, and he is trying to get back to do some things with it, and get more into science communication. However, that's another story. And I just think that we have, I think scientists also, do need to communicate. I mean, you're a brilliant communicator, and I know that you're concentrating on photography now, but you're also still a scientist, and that's wonderful to be able to have a foot in both worlds. I don't know if it feels that way to you or not, but I wish I had that ability, to cross over and find a little niche in the world of science as well.
Well, it's very kind, Joe. I mean, it's really very fortunate to be doing what one does. And, you take a look back and everything seems clear up to a point, but it is fascinating to me. I mean, the thing about, I think all of us that are in the call today, we have a curiosity about things, about, nature, about art, about how we can engage in that. And it's that curiosity, I think, that drives artists and scientists and creative people of all kinds. I mean, there's a creativeness in all aspects of these endeavors. I mean, when I think about, my days as a research physicist and my colleagues, and I mean, there's ultimately what drives you isn't, I mean, I guess money is always part of it, but it's just what you're interested in. It's like, why is it that when ice freezes, it floats? Why is that? Why is it that the sky is blue and then when the sun sets, the sky turns red? I mean, where does that red come from? There's a million things like that, and it's just this curiosity about, when I look at those ferns in the forest, why do they have the symmetry that they do? There's just all how does the spider know how to spin a web? No one taught it, and there's just a lot of great. There's a lot of great. I think it's just great joy, and I know what you mean about the. I do a lot of night photography. I do a lot of planning for night photography, where I just came back from a trip where I was photographing the lunar eclipse, and I had 2 pages of notes about what to do at what time with which lens and which camera settings, and just to remind myself at 1:30 in the morning after no sleep. And when I teach the planning side of things, people are like, well, Mike, don't you find that just really like depressing and sad? And I'm like, no, what's depressing and sad is to fly out to Death Valley and miss the shot because I hadn't planned it. Basically, I mean, in a nutshell. And so it's to each their own. I mean, ultimately, it's we all walk our different ways, and that's the thing that matters. I really believe that to be so important. But to me, the great thing about mathematics and science is that it gives us a predictive capability, and it gives us an ability to peer into the future with confidence. And one of the great things that happened with the vaccine development for the COVID pandemic is the ability for scientists to not have to engage in a 3-year process of trial and error, but to do a very targeted, predictive, we're going to do this and this is going to happen. type approach, and it's changed vaccine development forever. I mean, and it was like that. Look at us right now. I'm sitting in Minnesota in the U.S. You're sitting in the U.K. elsewhere. Where it's like I feel like I'm in the same room with you. I mean, the science and technology.
It absolutely is miraculous, isn't it? It really, really is.
Absolutely miraculous. I mean, just the things that we just kind of take for granted. So, I mean, it can be a little bit depressing because it does. I mean, I can explain the physics of a rainbow in such a way that it will suck the joy out of every rainbow. But it's, you know, I remember when I taught that, the students in my class were like, please don't tell your family that. You know, it's, you know, they don't need to hear that.
You know what? That's really interesting, though. I must bring you back to that one because I learned the physics of the rainbow from Galen Roll, from Mountain Light. That book was another life-changing experience for me.
Yeah, I think I've got it here on the bookshelf.
Yeah, oh, fantastic. Well, I still, you know, I always think Galen was probably in some ways a better writer than he was a photographer. I think he was so good at explaining how.
Yeah.
Oh, cool. Yeah,
it's slightly different.
Yeah.
No,
yeah,
that's a great book. Yeah.
But in Mountain Light, he's got a few examples of rainbows, but he explains it so well how it's formed. And although, and to me, the kind of loss of mystery was replaced by an even greater sense of wonder at how it worked. So I was fine with that, you know, and I always love the fact that when I'm on board ship and you know we might be going through some low-lying sea fog,
sure,
go up to the front of the prow of the ship, and there is a rainbow around your shadow, casting a Brocken spectre on almost onto this slightly invisible sea below you, you know, and you're thinking the sun is you know creating this image of you, you know, and you know sort of it's traveled sort of for 7 minutes or 9 minutes through space to create these light rays and all of that. I mean, I just think that's just fantastic. So
you know,
well, I think just because of course it's also true, is it not, that however much we know, however our scientific knowledge increases. There's a beautiful explanation for this given on a recent talk I listened to, where scientists are saying, if you think of the body of scientific knowledge as a bubble that's expanding, and the surface area gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and the edge of the unknowing becomes greater with it. So that the more we know, literally, the more we realize we don't know. So it's infinite. You know, the limits of knowledge are infinite, and you know, I guess it will always be that way. You know, we'll always be searching, and in the meantime, that we have art to try to translate the meaning of it, and yet art sort of does defy explanation and measurement. I don't know if that's a good thing or not, but it's a thing. And there's somebody who I have to analyze other people's photography quite often for them, for say Royal Photographic Society distinctions. It's quite an uncomfortable process because clearly you have to do it in a diplomatic way. You have to try to understand why a picture hasn't worked if you're, you know, providing positive feedback, and how pictures work is not always that clear. It's a bit of a mystery. So you could apply as many mathematical equations to it as you liked, and it still wouldn't necessarily explain it.
Yeah, you know, I would certainly agree with that. And you know, there's a feature of scientific knowledge that also has to be just recognized in passing, and that is that, you know, any scientist would tell you that you never achieve 100% knowledge. I mean, there's you never. I mean, what do I mean by that? You know, someone could discover like tomorrow that gravity has a tweak that, you know, changes it. And I think this is without getting too much off a deep end. So Gary, please, you know, edit this part out if you need. But I think one of the differences between science and religion, if you will, is that, you know, there's this absolute knowledge of you know, on the one hand, but then an acceptance that there will never be. I mean, there's always room for doubt, always room for, well, we're not. I mean, this is the model that fits the data, but if we get new data, we're going to need a new model. type of a thing. And so I just think that's one of those things that, but that was a thing, but there's something I've been wanting to bring up. So I'm going to try to bring it back to this somehow. I'm not quite sure how, if this is related, but it, in a way, comes, I think it touches on a number of things. And again, I think I brought this up with one of Gary's classes, but this is something I also, I say I'm an advocate for a way of thinking. And that is that, when you think about, the landscape, the process of creating a landscape, or, what's the importance of a landscape and so forth, and our own human vision. I mean, the rock spectrum that you were talking about, or a rainbow, I think one of the greatest disappointments to my students at the time when I was teaching the physics class, was that a rainbow isn't a thing that exists. A rainbow is only something that you see because of your orientation to light. It's not like there's a rainbow and I'm going to go to the rainbow, and it's like so when you saw that, I mean, only you saw that. If there was someone standing next to you, they would
see another one.
They're seeing a totally different one, right? I mean, when you see a star, and the light from that star has traveled, let's say, literally a couple thousand years, or from a distant galaxy, I mean, millions of years to travel to you, and that light left that galaxy and traveled through space over thousands of years and went into your eye. It didn't go into this person's eye. I mean, you're the only person that saw that ever.
Yeah.
Ever will see that.
Yeah.
And so, bringing it back to photography, then, to me, one of the most exciting things about photography, and this goes back to the local hero part of the discussion, is that we see our vision system is sort of a 35 millimeter lens, 50 millimeter lens, and we have a certain range of apertures of our the iris in our eye can produce, and our retina has a certain ISO response. We don't have a shutter. I mean, we have a lens cap, which is our eyelid, but our vision system works as a video camera, so it's downloading images about a 20th of a second. So what this means, though, is that anything that we see, normal human vision is 35 to 50 millimeter images with a 20th of a second shutter speed, and any other type of, if we use a 200 millimeter lens or a 14 millimeter lens, that's not human vision. I mean, that it isn't. And so, there's this debate, as I mentioned, I do a lot of night photography. There's a lot of post-processing and editing. And, there, inevitably at some point, someone's like, that's just not real. That's not what the camera saw. And I was like, well, no, it's not. The cameras can't see what I see. My eyes, or it's not what I saw, or either way you look at it, there's always a domain where the camera is capturing something that we can't see, or we're seeing something that the camera can't see. And Joe, I just wanted to ask you your thoughts on this. I'm sure this has come up with you over and over and over again.
Yeah, you bet, Mike. It's one of the most interesting philosophical conundra in photography, I think, which is really to do with the reality, what you might call the reality diet discourse or something like that. Because what is it's like, what is reality? And I just like to rewind a fraction on that and say that if you think of a vision, as vision itself is not the reality we think it is, because the brain is doing all the processing. So while we think we're looking at this kind of approximately 35 millimeter field of view, let's say, the sharp detail in it is constructed by the brain from that tiny area of data on the fovea that gives us sharp detail. And to me, that's one of the first justifications for digital photography, because digital in many ways is much more like human vision than a film camera is. I used to think the opposite was true, but I actually believe that digital is a better technology for that reason now, that it allows us to emulate human vision better. But then you have to say, when you take a photograph and you share it with others, are you presenting the eyewitness absolute facts, or is it a translation stroke interpretation of what you saw? I mean, the reality is it has to be the latter. And this is a challenging thing for me, because I truly believe in the illusory power of photography. So that it's at its most powerful when you believe it. Once you stop believing it, then it does lose something. So, but it is based on an illusion, that power. I think, and to some extent, maybe it's weakened over the years because people think, oh, it's just Photoshop. Now, when they see something really, really amazing, which is understandable, that the technology has changed that much. But I also feel that there's, for me personally, that working with the eyewitness, what I call the eyewitness tradition, has meaning. It gives meaning and significance to bearing witness to the beauty and wonder of the planet and what we see. And sometimes it's expressed through different emotions like anger or disappointment as well. But in general, my pursuit as an artist is beauty and wonder. And I think that's the more something seems to be real, the better. However, it isn't real. It's a translation. Ultimately it's an attempt at art. You may not think it's art, but whatever that means. But no other art form is subjected to these kind of conditions that photography is expected to, and assumptions about reality. It's part of its power, but it's an extremely complex and difficult topic, and ultimately we just have to navigate it. But I do think one has to have that debate with people who want to say, well, you can't do that because you can't use that lens because it's not natural, or you can't use that shutter speed because that's not how the world looks. Well, no, it isn't. But then the world doesn't look like a two-dimensional image anyway, because we see it through stereotypical vision. We experience depth and all the other things that we do, partly through touch and smell and sound as well. So it is a very specific medium. It's a medium. It's not reality. Does that make sense?
Oh, I love it. No, I mean, I'm just soaking it all in because I'm just soaking it all in because it's stuff that we've all thought about a lot, and it's a changing. I mean, so as I mentioned, I do a lot of night photography, and to me, the most satisfying images are ones that are a single capture, that you had to be at the right place at the right time. Snap. It's not a blend or
Yeah.
I've written a book about how to do blends and all this stuff to create more natural appearing images. But to me, the tip of the pyramid is, those single captures that capture a moment in time that have real significance. I mean, this is I won't say a historical document, but they do represent something that happened. And and this is part of the the burden of a scientific background, in the sense that, when you publish something in a scientific journal, you can't retouch things. You can't, take this out, or it just literally, this is it's like I'm collecting a datum. I'm collecting a series of data of these images, and I'm presenting them. I haven't touched them. You can interpret them. You're not interpreting through my lens. You can interpret them independently yourself, see if you come to the same conclusions. Art's not like that. And to me, that's the beauty of it, because it's a completely different output. It's like, are we sending this off to print? Are we putting it on social media? Are we hanging it? What are we doing with this thing? And if we're sending it to a scientific journal, then it has certain very stringent criteria, but the rest of it is art. And, if someone, there's people who just want to, put crazy things together, and I say, go for it. I'm not going to tell you not to do that.
Exactly.
Yeah. So, I mean, it's not my taste, but a lot of stuff that I do isn't your taste. So it's fine. That's the power. That's the beauty to me of the individual aspects of what we do. I mean, and what I try to do as a teacher is to encourage people to do whatever they want to do. And if they need help doing something, I'm happy to help them do that thing, but I'm certainly not going to try to tell them what's right and wrong. I mean, I don't think any of us would do that.
Absolutely. Well, if I may, I'd also like to just focus on your particular specialist area for a second, because one of the things that I feel really brings that point home is that when you photograph at night, and I presume at least at some of the time you're having to make time exposures, and your camera can see color that you can't.
Absolutely.
And it brings out beauty that is there, it's just that the nature of human vision with the rods and the cone systems, and I forget all the details at the back of the eye, but you simply can't see those colors. But the colors are there because the camera sees them. It's a pretty faithful reproduction. So which is true? And then in many ways, that translation is one of the most fascinating of all, because I think translating the color for in the landscape with stars is just absolutely fascinating. I think being able to bring out some of that inherent color is great, but if it's overdone, then it starts to lose that kind of credibility as well. So if it's done with great artistry, it can produce stunningly beautiful results, and which you do. So I know very little about it, but what I do know is that we see almost no color at night, and so whereas the camera does, and I think that's fascinating.
Oh, it is. And I distinctly remember the first time I took a digital photograph at night with a fast lens, and I was able to I pulled up the image. It was a terrible image. It was blurry, it was just out of focus, but all the stars had colors. And I backpacked into this location. I was by myself, and it was under moonlight, and I just started laughing. I was like, that's how it's done. That's how they do that. Yeah. I get it. And, one of my favorite things for people to, people sometimes think if you're going to shoot the Milky Way, you have to go out in a new moon when there's no moon. And frankly, having, like you say, a moonlit landscape, the image behind Gary, for example, is you sort of rely on moonlight to bring out the natural landscape. And so often I'll show a picture, let's say star trails or, anything like this. And people say, well, wait, are those stars? Because you have this, it looks like daytime.
Yeah.
And it really is a kind of a neat aspect of that, for sure, is the ability and in fact, it's kind of interesting because there's a certain debate even now ongoing about what is the correct color of the night sky, because even if the Milky, you'll see these images of the Milky Way galaxy, and there's some debate, should it be kind of the bright part, should they be yellowish, should they be kind of a light brown? Astronomy people have this sort of debate because but interestingly, this is the other thing I just remembered that I wanted to bring up, is I don't do any like IR infrared, photography and so forth. But when I was teaching this, I did a little bit of research into how, different species perceive the world. If you think about, if for a minute, if you think about your perception of the world, if you were like a tick or a rattlesnake, where you really are looking for hot, warm things. So your view of the world is not like a red, orange, yellow, green, blue. It's more like is it hot or is it not hot?
It's a heat map. Really.
It's a heat map. And there are a few species of fish I found that when they were going through the reproductive cycles, they would produce a coloration that was only visible in the ultraviolet range of the spectrum. So that the presumption was that the opposite gender would have to be able to see in the ultraviolet range of the spectrum to see this. And then if you look at like infrared photography, if it's well done, it's pretty neat. But again, if you think about it, if I may for a sec, if we were to see in the radio, like our cell phones, I can be in a room with no windows and communicate very successfully using a cell phone, because the wireless signal, the radio signal, can go right through the walls as if they're transparent. So if we saw in the radio frequency spectrum, part of the spectrum,
see through solid walls.
Yeah, the wires and the metal would be black, but everything else there'd be like glass. And so it's kind of like when you say what's real, it's just nothing. It's just a matter of perception, how you're perceiving it, and it's just so much. It's just a kind of I don't know if I'm trying to make a point, but I'm just like rejoicing in the weirdness of the world more than anything else.
Yeah, no, it's mind-blowing stuff. It really is. It's fantastic. Lovely to hear. I'm going to turn the lights on in this room, otherwise I know I'm going to disappear fairly soon.
It's fading into nautical twilight.
Exactly.
Well, Gary, this is some great stuff here. My goodness, it's just.
Isn't it just?
So that was your first question. What's your next question?
I only had one, but something did occur to me, and that is, we've talked about landscape at ground level, and yes, we have talked about the stars as well, but to what extent is the sky part of the landscape? To what extent is it separate from, and to what extent does it complement what's going on at ground level?
Shall I go first?
Yeah.
Please.
I mean, I've probably done quite a bit of thinking about this, recently as well. The sky, I mean, you can break it down quite simply. Actually, the sky is fundamentally it's obviously a light source, 99.999% of the time, but it's also part of the picture, and that's a pretty kind of unique role in a way for anything in the visual domain. But I think that it's much more complicated than it first appears. So one of the things that really fascinates me is to try to compare the landscape with the still life studio. So when I was a still life photographer, we had full control of the light, but we would generally try to use a single light source if possible, because the most beautiful light tends to be something that emulates the light of the sun or daylight. But you would be able to control it all with huge reflectors, or sometimes shooting through a scrim, sometimes subtracting light, taking light out, and you could control its shape and its character. And that is exactly what happens in the landscape, thanks to clouds to a large extent. So this is one of the things that's really interesting. I was going to ask Gary about the night sky and the moon and all that, because moonlight tends to be quite harsh, because on the whole, it's clearer often at night when the moon is out. In daytime, on clear blue sky days, and I'm sure there's plenty of people watching this evening who will know that this is true, on clear blue sky days, it's really, really hard to make good landscape photographs, because what happens is that the sun becomes like a spotlight, and there's very little moderation to it, and the shadows become very dark, and they also become completely blue. So in practice, if you're looking at a landscape that's blue sky, no clouds and sunlight only, all of the shadow areas are blue, and that and if you can see into them because they're so dark, and that contributes to an incredible harshness. So the sky, the presence of clouds is probably the single most important in terms of helping your photography, quality of your photography, and the emotional content of your photography. Is landscape, is clouds in the landscape help greatly because they moderate the light, they soften it, they change the color of it sometimes. And then of course, when the sky is part of the picture, clouds are an abstraction. They are literally the greatest abstraction in our experience. So there's the sky around us, when it's full of clouds, some of the time it's very calm and still, sometimes it's moving around, sometimes it's stormy and wet and all those things, but in a sense it's the great abstract painting of nature. That's how I think of it. And you should apply a lot of focus and concentration to the sky. If you're going to use the sky in a picture, it needs to be a positive part of the picture. So, and then finally there's the issue of color. So I mentioned that the sky, the images look very cold often when they're blue sky days and sunlight, and yet the sun itself is neutral, the sunlight produced, except when it's really, really low. So why does the image look cold? Well, the answer is because the shadows are blue, so that all the areas where the blue, where the shadow is, there's a coldness and a harshness and a hardness to it. So as the sun itself, fundamentally, according to Kodak, and there was a lot of research done many, many years ago when film was being refined and developed about an absolute measure of color temperature. And so it became this sort of standard that we generally work to, which is the realization that human vision is based on, normal daylight, which is, I don't know, 5,400 degrees Kelvin or something like that. But at other times of day, and depending on the amount of clouds there are, the color's completely different to that. And we often don't realize that. Why? Because our brain adjusts for the color. So the brain is constantly adjusting between warm and cool tones. So at the moment, if you look at me, it looks a bit odd because I've got tungsten light at about 2,300 degrees Kelvin behind me. And then if I look out the window, that's the blue light of what remains of the sky out there. And so the color of light, I mean, I could look around everybody's icon who's watching us tonight and tell you probably what the light is doing in their room, you know, what sort of lights they've got. Are they fluorescents? Are they incandescents? Are they LEDs? And whether they've got any remnants of the day coming in as well, because that's what you do as a photographer. You learn to analyze light, and we can all do that using that model, looking at the sky outside. And it's really, I just find it fascinating that if you use that analogy, you can actually, it might sound like it diminishes it, but you can treat landscape as a giant still life. And the character in the light, the shape of the light on trees or on rock faces, and the color of the light are all byproducts of the sky itself, the clouds in the sky or the absence of clouds in the sky. Sometimes there's no visible sunlight because the clouds have cut all the sun out. And when that happens, the color is cool. And the reason for that is that the sun was penetrating some of the clouds, dispersing that kind of whitish, grayish light. But there's an awful lot of blue sky behind that. And that blue sky is also penetrating. And so what you get is a kind of blend of the neutral light of the sun and the blue light of the sky. On another kind of lighting, let's say it's a blue sky day, there's sunlight, but you're standing in a shadow of a house and there's no clouds. You try photographing with no filter and daylight color balance in that shadowy area, and the light is literally blue. So if you took a white piece of paper and put it on the ground and photographed it with daylight balanced film, you would get a blue paper. So that is literally how it works. And the brain does a terrific job of compensating for all of that. But actually, it's really good to know and understand that on one side of a building or a tree even, the colors can be different because the color of the light itself is different. And although things have their own native color, obviously I'm looking out the window and it looks pretty green out there. But anything that's doesn't have a strong native color, so let's say limestone or quartzite rock or a sandy beach, you know, with a lot of silica in it, they're incredibly responsive to the color of light. So those surfaces are often among the most exciting of all to photograph in different lighting conditions, because they literally reflect the color of the light itself, and that creates a wonderful, often just exciting imagery. And you can use the transitions from warm to cool that exist out there in nature. We probably all do it a lot of the time without really realizing it. But I think that having a sense of it gives you the ability to then seek out places where you will get remarkable juxtapositions of color. And a good example, Mike, if we think of the US, is in canyons. So in the canyons in the US, you are often in the deep shadows, and there'll be sunlight penetrating the canyon on red rock. And then elsewhere, there's blue sky above, because it's a boring American day with very, very clear, very hot and sunny and everything, and you're in a lovely cool canyon. Red rock, sunlight, and what's happening is in the water in front of you, you get these incredible reflections where it's partly red because of the reflected light, and it's partly literally brilliant blue because of the reflection of the sky above. And you can create a wonderful abstractions and fascinating images that vary between pictorialism and abstraction using those remarkable colors. You can find it in the UK as well. It's more likely to be by the coast, but using shadow and what I call the borrowed light from beyond the shadows into the shadows is a really interesting way of animating objects, be it rocks or plants or anything like that. And the color of light itself is one of the great lessons of landscape photography, I think. So that's my little two pennyworth on the sky for you.
Well, I love it. I mean, it brings to mind a couple of things. As always, it's great. One of which is some of my most memorable sunsets have been when I've been out in a desert someplace, and there's been clouds in the sky, and 15 minutes, half an hour after sunset, you have that beautiful alpenglow after the sun has dipped below the horizon. It's only illuminating the clouds. And the sky, of course, turns this fantastic, this light, this pink display. But the desert sand, which is, as you say, like mostly silica or whatever, picks that up. And the whole, I can remember a couple times vividly where I felt like I was inside this pink candy, sugar candy thing where everything was, I was like, there's just no way to just represent that. But then the other thing it brings to mind is, I think it might have been a Galen Rowell article about, he traveled from, where he lived in the Bay Area in California to a city in Europe, and the streetlights were the yellow sodium streetlights. And he was rummaging around in his camera bag trying to find one of those yellow Post-it notes.
Mm-hmm.
And he couldn't find it. And the reason he couldn't find it is because yellow lights, yellow thing, it looked white because everything was yellow.
Yeah.
And it didn't have a yellow color to stand out. And he realized, and it's like you say, and here's the third example of how your brain compensates for things is, I'm sure we've all, you're all familiar with the blind spot where you forgive my thumb. But if you, if you keep both eyes open, you just cover up, one eye, you keep them both open, you put your thumb in front of this, and you move it off to one side. Right about here, the tip of your thumb disappears because that light hits the optic nerve in your retina. There's no sensors there. So what's fascinating about that is if you do that where you're facing a red wall, your brain fills that in with red. But if you do that against a blue wall, your brain fills that in with blue. So it does kind of like a cloning operation, which is just incredible. So again, I don't know if I have a point. I'm rejoicing in the marvelousness of the universe, but it really is all about the color of the light. And this issue of white balancing and adjusting the color, it's just so important because and you're quite right about the blueness in the shade. I mean, most people are aware of the blue sky, but they just don't have this realization that it is a source of blue light, as you're describing. And when you block the light of the sun, you're just experiencing the blue light from the sky. And it's what's interesting is at night, actually, there's a phenomenon that's called, especially in dark locations, that's called air glow, that is the result of basically the sun's energy being absorbed by the atmosphere during the day, and then at night the atmosphere just basically re-radiates that, but it's primarily a greenish color from the oxygen and then a pinkish purplish color from the nitrogen. So when people have measured, if you go to a moonless, high altitude moonless night and measure, first of all, it's remarkable we can see to get around, but you measure how much light is coming from the sky. I think it's something like 60% is air glow, 30% is starlight. I mean, the Earth's atmosphere is always giving off light, during the day and during the night.
So Mike, on that note, here's a question for you. Well,
sure.
One thing that I'm always fascinated by is we often think the night sky is black. Well, obviously it's not black because if you take a photograph, well, like your photographs, well, the landscape's always much darker than the sky. It's clearly there is light and probably color there. But from what you're saying, actually quite a bit of that is within our own atmosphere, yes, rather than from starlight only.
Correct. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you think about the moon, if you're on the moon and you're on the side of the moon that's not being illuminated by the sun, then it's just black. I mean, all you're seeing there is just starlight and the blackness of space. But whenever you look at a crescent moon, and you can see the thin, I'll put my arm down here, thin crescent, then you can also see the earth shine. That's the reflected light from the earth, and that's that's where that's coming from. But yeah, the Earth's atmosphere is actually quite, and that's why during yesterday morning or 2 nights ago, during the lunar eclipse, the full moon was so bright it causes the sky to be a blue color even at night. So if you take a photograph of this, as we were just talking about, you get this blue sky at night. But during the lunar eclipse, the the moon just, of course, was locked. There was no sunlight hitting the moon because it was eclipsed. There was a slight reddish color, but that was insufficient to illuminate the Earth. So all of a sudden, the sky, for a period of about half an hour or so, the sky became clear enough that we could see the Milky Way, you could see stars, and then 45 minutes later, it became bright blue again as the moon came out of totality and stuff. So, yeah, the atmosphere it's just a wonder. There's some wonderful phenomena associated with light, the color of light of the atmosphere, and how it dictates the appearance of the images that we create. And it's, I anytime I'm in a place with a clear horizon, it's a clear night, if it's up in the mountains, desert, on the seaside, and there's a sunset, I just marvel at the color changes from the oranges. It sort of goes from, one of the images in my books, I take an image right at sunset, facing right at the direction of the sun, and it goes from orange to blue, or actually a few minutes afterwards. And not directly opposite that, you have the Earth's shadow, and it goes from blue to pink. So I put them side by side, and the color palettes are inverted.
Yeah, exactly. That's beautiful. That's lovely. And also, I always think it's great when you see that transition where above the Earth's surface, it's blue, and then it goes pink. And when it's really well defined, that you are looking at the shadow of the Earth falling across the sky. And that's how Galen described it, because he was very, very good at explaining how the alpenglow worked. So yeah, thanks to him again. But isn't it interesting too, how the illusion of human vision is that we're kind of looking through space as we look outside, but reality is we're looking through a substance, a gas. That's right. Otherwise we won't be able to breathe. So but it's a kind of something you can relate to on a conscious level more when you see a really complex sky, because the sky itself is composed of all these many layers of gases at different pressure and humidity and so forth, and that's why you see the clouds developing in their different ways. But I mean, I still struggle with that, because you sort of just, it's clear there, right? Sure, there's nothing in the way. No, there is. It's air, and it's physically quite dense stuff. You got to swim through it sometimes.
Oh, yeah.
So yeah, it's well, I suppose in a way, part of our sense of wonder about the universe is because human experience is so very specific. We live in this niche, on the surface of the planet with with our own kind of sense of scale and proportion. And there are so many other things at scales and proportions that are almost inconceivable for us, imagination-wise. Especially the sky on the one hand, and the molecular and atomic world on the other.
Right.
And we're somewhere in the middle of it all. And I often think there's a wonderful book that I had. I think I've lost it now, but called The Powers of 10.
Oh yeah.
You familiar with that?
Of course, yeah. It's wonderful. Yeah.
But I would really recommend it to anybody who's curious about these things. And what it does is it puts human vision right in the middle of the book, and then at one step beyond on either side, you go to a sort of close up on one side, and kind of up in the air on the other, and then gradually get further and further away from the Earth until you start moving through time as well as space. That's towards the beginning of the book, and then in the other direction you head down, you burrow down into matter until you eventually reach the atom and beyond.
It's just I absolutely love that connection. This will be my last astronomy tangent, I promise, but I just want to bring this in because I think it's something that along those lines of scales and the powers of 10, and how you appreciate looking into space. I know this is a landscape thing, but boy, it's one of my favorite things. One of the things that when on a clear night, when you're able to see the stars, when you're looking through this gaseous atmosphere, I mean, it is remarkable that the only thing separating us from the stars is just gas. There's no physical lid that we have to open to get out there. And one of my favorite things to do, Joe, maybe you do this too on your stuff, and Gary, is when I have a clear night, a really, really clear night, and there's no moon and it's just stars, maybe in the summertime, or maybe in the fall, in the September, October, when it's dark. I'll have everyone's sort of lay on their backs in a circle with their heads in a circle, and we're all just looking straight up. when we look straight up, our peripheral vision is such that we don't see the horizon at all. It's just underneath our peripheral vision. So all we literally are seeing are stars and space. And if we just hang out there for like 10 or 15 or 20 minutes, you realize that there's space is very much not uniform. There's stars, of course, everywhere, but there's some patches of darkness. And then there's some really bright stars. And, some of the really bright stars are just physically closer to us than, the dimmer stars. And those dark patches are clouds of dust that block the stars behind them. So if you have a dust cloud with a star in front of it, then that star is in front of you and the dust cloud. So you have this, my point is you have this three-dimensional sense of space, which is spine tingling. And, the view from aboard the International Space Station, the astronauts are only a couple 300 miles closer to that than you are. And so, that in the scale of things, that's nothing. Literally, we are all astronauts. Every time we look into space, you don't have to go into space to view space. You just do this exercise and you can get this marvelous three-dimensional view of space that it just stays with you. So I just had to kind of slip that in there somehow. And I promise that'll be my last astronomy.
No, that's absolutely great. I love that. I think, I was, when I lived in the States in the early 80s, I used to listen to Carl Sagan every week on the telly.
Yeah.
So, I still feel that the ability to connect, and I always find it fascinating that actually the physical earth sciences are absolutely essential for understanding the universe. So, if you go to another planet, you're still going to need geologists and so on, to tell you what you're looking at. And actually in Earth, my son's course as an undergrad, although 60% of it was geology, the other 40%, a lot of it is astrophysics. It's helping to try to understand how the Earth is created, its origins as far as we know, and so on. All of the traumas that it experienced in its younger time, and so on, and what the physical and chemical matters are that make up the Earth and indeed us. And so that is still all ongoing out there. We are part of the universe in that sense, and being able to look at the night sky. I think we're so preoccupied with our lives on Earth, or all the sort of relative trivia, let's say, that surrounds us in our daily lives, and I think sometimes to be able to be reminded, that we're part of a much bigger universe is just, one of the wonders of human understanding.
Yeah, I think that landscape photography in general has that ability to convey that sense. If it includes the night sky, if it includes the daytime sky, but just the ability to connect and appreciate some of nature's beauty is just one of the great gifts of landscape photography, for sure.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that, one of the things that we haven't discussed, but I think probably will be undiscussable, if that is a word, which I'm sure it isn't, is the concept of beauty, and where it comes from, and why it has this kind of universal meaning for us. Although it probably means something slightly different to every person. But to me, it's actually that beauty and art and what we do with our cameras are all very, very closely linked.
Mm-hmm.
That sense of what it means to be fully human. So,
sure.
Yeah, I think it's great to get that ability to sort of cross these two kind of different genres. Really, I'm not saying that you obviously do some landscape photography as well. And now that I've listened to you, Mike, I feel like I should be getting out there at night more often and pointing my camera at the stars too.
Oh, it's, I look at some of the the tremendous body of work, Joe, that you created over the years. And it's just, I don't know, it's the notion of beauty is a tough one. I know a couple of professor friends put together an entire course. It's called Goodness, Truth, and Beauty. And they spent the entire semester talking about those concepts and this sort of stuff. But no, the stuff that you've created is just, it's intangible. It just pulls you in, and it's calming and soothing, and it just resonates for all of us. So we just appreciate all the work that you've done over the years and sharing that with us all, because it is inspiring and motivating. And, you know, it just gives you hope that there's still beauty out in the natural world that's accessible to us. And, you know, the degree to which it's naturally wild and everything else, it's still out there, you know. And
it is, and I agree. I mean, I think that is, well, it's that knowing it's there is really important. We don't even have to go out and bear witness to it ourselves. I think a lot of the time I get great joy from looking at great photography by others, whether it's in the National Geographic or you know, books, great books of photographers who I admire. And I don't feel I've got to jump on a ship or whatever and go to those places. I just, but knowing there's something that, as you say, that is calming and reassuring about it, to know that nature's beauty is still all around us, and that we can sort of touch it in some way. I think that is a very, very important kind of touchstone for us all in many ways. And I hope that landscape photography generally can play a role in, you know, positive force, you know, for society. And I think individually, you know, most of us feel that it's quite therapeutic.
The perception of landscapes has probably changed in England quite a bit over the last 300 years. If we go back in time, only those with access to the big house ever saw landscape painting of Italy. Then if we go back 75 years to the industrial heartland of Yorkshire, where we are, a landscape was a trip to Blackpool or Scarborough and the blue sky to get rid of the smog. But now we can be a lot more creative with landscapes, capture mood, calming, soothing, weather and so on, particularly in England where the weather changes a lot in a week. So how do you think landscape photography is perceived now?
Well, that's a great one for Joe. I'll see if I can add my 2 cents of that, Len. So thanks for asking the question, first of all, because you're quite right, of course, that, you know, the human landscape and the natural landscape has changed over the last several hundreds of years, and it's continuing to do so quite rapidly. You know, with climate change taking place and human population growing and people moving. You know, it's a very interesting question, isn't it? Because there's a lot of folks who haven't had the chance to experience natural landscapes to the degree that many of us have had. And so I think it's a widely diverse answer depending on who you ask that question to, you know, because some folks are, you know, it depends on where you live. So I guess to me, I would say, just as a starting point, rather than to say, this is a definition of landscape that we must subscribe to, I'd rather, you know, my approach personally, just, you know, Mike's opinion is that each of us, you know, each citizen of the world would have their own landscape. Hey, Joe. And that's fine. That's good enough. That's all that really matters to them. And if they expand that notion of landscape by traveling or through exploring or through anything, internet research, that's fine too. But Joe, we had a question from Len about how, if I'll try to paraphrase it, that in the UK and England in particular, the notion of landscape has changed a lot over the last several hundreds of years because of people's ability to travel and the change in the environment. How would we sort of consider the term landscape to apply today?
Oh, what a fascinating question. So, well, in a way, I think we have to sort of ask ourselves how it began. Just briefly, I guess that maybe some of you will be familiar with this, but it's a Dutch term, landskip, and it came from. It's meant to define the observed territory of the world. So it's kind of connected with the idea of seeing. Because otherwise you just have, well, countryside or land or territory or whatever. So when we say the word landscape, and I think this still holds true, it's to do with the act of observation, or I would say that it is. I mean, maybe it's not always used in that way, but when I'm talking about landscape, it's kind of to do with being critically observed. But as to whether yeah, I don't know whether everybody else necessarily feels that or not, but that's because of maybe the art historical background sort of thing. As to how it's changed, I'm not sure if I can really add to that. Obviously, it has changed enormously, hasn't it? I'm not. Yeah. Well, I'll hand it back to you at this point, Mike, because I think that maybe you can expand it, and then I'll try and come back to you on it.
Yeah, I mean, I guess my answer really was based in the notion that climate change is affecting the natural landscape. Human population growth is affecting the natural landscape. From a night photography point of view, light pollution, the propagation of lights at night is affecting things. But that from a perspective of an individual, I guess my point was that rather than this is a notion of landscape that you have to learn and belong to, so to speak. It's really wherever that person is, anywhere in the world, their environment is their landscape. If it's if their environment is within a city or a street environment, then that is a landscape. And it's just whatever that person. I don't want to say here's the thing of landscapes, and only those who can access it have access to it. So I see Len nodding, so I think that was a good answer, I hope.
And if I could just very briefly say that I was asked to come up with a definition of landscape actually by the Royal Photographic Society a couple of years ago when we were proposing these new distinctions. And we've said very much that landscape includes everything from the wild, the most extreme wilderness habitats to the urban landscape and everything in between. So used, unused, the changed landscape, the altered landscape, the wild landscape, the urban landscape.
Good stuff. Now, Andy Hopkirk put his hand up some time ago and it was yellow, and now it's turned blue, and I wonder if that's just the blood draining out for it being up so long. But Andy, whenever you're ready.
Yeah, I think I've unmuted now. I just wanted to pick up on the science art thing and the response that these invoke in you, because I'm a scientist by profession, but when I was at university, I hung around with the artists because they were the more interesting people. So I've always been kind of in between the two, and there's the comment about they're both exploratory activities. You're curiosity driven. You're trying to understand, represent something. They both end up with abstractions. A picture is an abstraction. It's on the wall. You can look at it. The current theory, the current model is an abstraction of the reality of the world. It isn't the world. It's an abstraction of the world. And in the way that in art, you've got these waypoints along the way. In science and landscape of astrophotography, if you want, I think you have the same things. There are these sublime images in astrophotography that are waypoints. And I'm thinking of, for example, the Earthrise over the moon from Apollo 8 in the 1960s. That is a landscape photograph, if ever there was one. It's just not a natural landscape on Earth. Then you've got Carl Sagan and his pale blue dot, the Earth from 4 billion miles away. That is a landscape photograph showing our position in the universe, if ever there was one. And then now through the late 1990s into the 2000s, we've got this fantastic corpus of deep sky images from Hubble, the best of which are as good a landscape as anything you can point at anywhere on the world. So this thing about the sublime of nature that you see in landscape photography, whether it's Yosemite or canyons in the Midwest or ice scapes in Antarctica, I get the same reaction to those as I do when I look at a Hubble picture or the pale blue dot or Earthrise over the sun, over the moon. And those latter three are technological achievements as much as artistic achievements. Hence, these two things are overlapping strongly in my mind.
Yeah, fantastic, Andy. I mean, love it.
Yeah, same here. I mean, that's just fantastic. And it's to do with the imagination. you know, that curiosity and the imagination are obviously very closely linked. What we find, a sense of wonder. Well, one of the interesting things I would like to bring up in relation to what you've just described is that you use the word sublime, which I think is an excellent use of it. But the original meaning of sublime, if we go back, well, as I understand it, and I forget the writer who coined it into common parlance, but an English writer, and at the time, it was also very closely connected to the idea of fear and terror, and beauty all together. And in some ways, when you look at, you know, whether it's Hubble, you know, pictures of the Crab Nebula, or pictures of moon, you know, or the Earthrise above the moon's surface, and so on. These are pictures that embody the idea of great danger and fear in various different ways. I mean, in a remote way, in the case of the Crab Nebula, but you know, for Michael Collins or whoever it was who took the picture of the Earthrise as potentially an incredibly risky, you know, his situation was unbelievably vulnerable, and there is something very sublime about that. You know, to go back to the 1700s when that term was coined, many of the romantic artists at the time would respond to it by painting avalanche scenes, for example, or a little later on, if you know, a few decades later, Turner strapped himself to a mast on a ship in the English Channel in a storm and painted the storm, one of his most well-known paintings. And then a contemporary of Turner's, John Martin, painted The Great Day of His Wrath and various other so-called sublime paintings, which, you know, in many ways find their echo in contemporary culture today, because we have this need to be terrified safely. Usually in a film, in a film place, you know, watching a movie, cinema. Sorry.
You said that earlier, right at the very beginning, when you talked about the taking 3 or 4 days to acclimatize to being in nature, and the peril of the wildlife that can kill you, etc., adds that flavor and intensity to the experience. And the note I was making when you were talking about that was that the photographer is on a journey. They enjoy the journey. The traveling is the event. The photograph is the product of the journey. It's not like the tourist who takes the easy route, takes the snapshot, moves on to the next destination. So there's something in there for me that what both of you were saying about the photograph is part of the record of the journey, and you can revisit the same journey many times and get a different photograph every time. It's not like being a tourist. It's a traveling thing rather than tourism. And Michael Collins was the ultimate traveler to the moon. Voyager was our traveler to the outer limits of the solar system, and Hubble is now our traveler to deep space. It all kind of connects. It's the same language that we use to describe these things.
Yeah.
And I absolutely love it. I'd also add the rovers on Mars now.
Yeah.
Pulling back all the, I mean, because it's incredible. I mean, it looks just like some of the deserts on Earth, and it's hard to believe it's not a movie set. But but no, that's an excellent point about the technological achievement, and also this notion of terror. I mean, that's exactly it. I mean, anytime I go camping, I mean, there's always this, you know, there's this sense as night falls and, you know, things kind of close in, you realize, well, I'm here for the night. I'm not hiking out tonight, you know, and, you know, night falls and it becomes dark. You're still alive. You haven't eaten yet. And then all of a sudden your kind of night vision adapts and you suddenly can see again. And all of a sudden this whole universe just opens up, and that feeling of safety, and you belong to this. You know, I mean, we're part of this world. This is, you know, this is not like being underwater or anything like that. It's just a fantastic feeling. And that feeling of security and like you say, it is a feeling of accomplishment too, that, you know, it took some effort to get in there and to get the shot. And so, yeah, it's all part and parcel of the journey for sure. Yeah.
Right. Thanks. Great listening to you talk.
Thanks, Andy. That's really kind.
Thanks, Andy. Nice question. Anybody else got a question?
All good, Gary. I should just while we're waiting, in case anybody else, I just want to apologise. I think I'm staying with my mum at the moment. I think we just lost a phone signal. It wasn't my power cutting out. I promise.
That's fine. No problem.
Good to be back.
Yeah, good to have you back.
If I could just say that actually, almost by coincidence, given the way the conversation has gone, Mike, I'm picking up my son from Oxford tomorrow, and then we're heading north, and we're going to keep going north because we're going to end up in Westeros in Scotland, and we're walking into the Great Wilderness. In fact, on Tuesday.
Oh, wow.
So from Poole, we'll have 5 nights out, hopefully. So now that I've been, talking about star photography, I'm really stoked to see it. Although, to be honest, it's actually too light in Scotland at this time of year.
Oh, sure.
To get a really kind of dark night sky. So it'll be kind of twilighty.
That's great. Well, keep your eye out for aurora as well. There's been some activity with the sun that you may pick up some of that.
Okay.
There's a big blast over the last few days that there's always something to keep an eye out. But yeah, it's great to hear. And you might see as Gary was saying, noctilucent clouds, and there's always something going on up there.
Absolutely, yeah.
Well, have a great, safe trip there, Joe. I mean, I'm a little envious of that, so I'll look forward to hearing about that when you get back.
Oh, thanks.
Yeah.
It was good to get Andy's point actually too, because it reminded me that although we're going there for the photography, but actually it really is about the experience. And if we get a few good pictures, that'll be a nice bonus. But yeah, it'd be great to get out there.
Last call for questions. Does anybody else want to ask anything of Mike and Joe? Len has another one.
You've talked a lot about Galen Roll. Which of his books do you recommend of the ones that you can get on Amazon UK? I mean, I've heard lots and lots about him over the years, but I didn't realise you could still get some of his books new.
Yeah, it's a very good question. I mean, I would have to recommend Mountain Light if it can still be obtained. Honestly, I'm sure it can be obtained used. Whether it's available new, I'm not sure. I'd be surprised. But it was a very successful book, and there were many copies printed. So for sure, it'd be available secondhand. And the reason, I'm sure his other books are very, very good. But I think for the photographer, it's just one of the most brilliantly. It's both personal, slightly quite autobiographical, but it has loads of really fascinating practical tips on pictures and how they're made, and how he developed his own particular techniques for making them. And he was a phenomenal athlete. I think we have to bear that in mind. So most of us can't do the stuff that he could do, but nevertheless, he explains the physics of what he was looking at really, really well. So as well as being aesthetically, they're very sensitively done. So that's a superb book.
Yeah, right. Thanks.
Yeah, I second that. There's another book that I thought that I had. There's only a couple places that it would be, and I'm not seeing it here. Wow, it's so odd. But oh, here it is. This is the one. I would highly recommend this one.
Huh.
I don't know if you can.
That one new. So it says.
Oh, great! Go for that.
Because this is a collection of his articles for Outdoor Photography magazine, and it's just a really, there's some fantastic. Here's kind of there's things like this. He talks about it. It's just in addition to Mountain Light, I would recommend this one very strongly. So I don't know if I assume it's called The Art of Adventure Photography. And, you probably heard the saying, but, he was asked, what's the secret to great outdoor photography? And his answer was F8 and be there.
Which confuses a lot of landscape photographers who think you have to stop down more than that, but in fact you don't. So most of the time.
I've only been to the USA once, southern Texas, and getting on South Padre Island with all the big skyscrapers, then just walking a mile further away from a complete wilderness. Just
Wow,
yeah.
that's cool. I've
Probably
never been
now, but it was there 10 years
Yeah.
ago. And it's very difficult to get that in England. Yeah, even
Well-
if you go up one of our remote dales, we're never 5 miles from habitation.
That's true. That's true.
Yeah.
Well, one thing that I just wanted to say was interesting seeing that picture of Galen hanging off El Capitan there, Michael, on the cover of that book. And I was lucky enough. Yeah, exactly. I mean, and we were talking briefly about Yosemite. I've been several times. I wouldn't say I'm a Yosemite veteran, but I've it is one of the great places to visit on planet Earth. And it has got a kind of nature's cathedral-like quality because of the scale of it when you're in there. So we were comparing it briefly with Canyon de Chelly, which has got a bit narrower, but it's there's nowhere quite like Yosemite, and it has a really interesting role in the history of photography, which I wasn't aware of until recently when I read a book about the pioneering California photographer Carleton Watkins.
Yeah.
And I think that it's a really, really important figure in photography, almost lost in popular culture. But his work is actually, it blazed a trail for photography and for romantic art. He inspired a lot of the Hudson River School painters as well, who used his work as source material for painting. This is in the 1860s and 1870s, and his photography actually brought the California landscape, to the attention of the world, because it traveled to Paris and to London as part of international fairs, in which United States had had stalls and so on, or very important stands. His work began during the American Civil War, in fact, the early 1860s. And at that time, it wasn't clear that California was definitely going to be, stay as part of the United States. I mean, I just found out so much history from reading about Carleton Watkins, and he was a brilliant photographer, absolutely brilliant. Most of Ansel Adams's most famous compositions are actually copies of Watkins's.
Yes, I've noticed the same, well, not the same tripod holes, but near enough the same standing place.
Yeah, and I mean, not to diminish what Ansel did, which is great, but a lot of people feel he was a pioneer, or actually he was, in many ways, he was following in Watkins's footsteps, and of course many people have followed in Ansel's footsteps too. So I think one should, including me. Make that clear. I was lucky enough to do a workshop. I've done 3 actually this year with Charlie Kramer. I don't know if you know him, Mike, but he's a great Californian landscape photographer, a lovely, lovely guy, who was also a friend of Ansel's. And I always feel there's something quite profound about the fact that I can still chat to Charlie today, and Charlie knew Ansel, and Ansel were all witness to the San Francisco earthquake as a young child. And at that time, Carleton Watkins was in San Francisco as an elderly gentleman, and having all his work destroyed. That was partly why his work's not so well disseminated or known today, because nearly all of his original glass plates were destroyed in the San Francisco fire.
Wow.
That followed the earthquake.
Wow, 1906.
Absolutely, yeah. So but you have this kind of but 3 generations of photographers connect us right back
shake
to
hands. I want to shake your hand. So now I've shaken the hand of. There we go.
There you go.
Okay, then.
Like
Enjoy tonight.
Yeah, it's a great one. I mean, it's amazing to think about these stories of connections, not to try to compete in any. I mean, this is very much not a name thing, but it just brings to mind a story from. I did this project with a ranger of the Grand Canyon National Park over this last year on whether these early explorers could see a comet from rafting down this river, and he was describing somehow he was having in this bizarre twist, he managed to have, he was having, I think, dinner with one of the astronauts from the space station somehow, because he's a park ranger in his national government. And it's just somehow they ended up doing this. And he was relating how he was, because you can actually watch, I'm sure many of you have seen the International Space Station go by overhead.
Yeah.
And he was describing how on this one night he was watching it, and all of a sudden there was this kind of like glare, this really unusual glare that kind of developed around it. And he was like, do you have any idea what that could be? And he was like, wait a minute, was it? And they kind of drilled down to the dates. And I'm thinking it was, so I think the Arizona State Senator, there's twin astronauts, Scott Kelly and Mark Kelly. I think it might have been one of those two. And the other one was actually on board the space station. And what he actually saw was the door being opened and stuff being jettisoned.
Wow.
So this is not a friend of a friend story. This is like, this ranger, Radar Lane was the ranger in, and it was just this incredible coincidence. He actually saw this happen and could relate it back to that. And it's like when you think, I guess what I'm trying to say is it's just the story of weird connections of how you can, it's just great to imagine these connections between, the world is smaller than we think, I guess is what it is. And, Gary, thanks to you for organizing this thing tonight, to bringing us all together. It's making the world a little bit smaller. I feel like I'm getting to know some new friends along the way. And Joe, it's just been great chatting with you about all these different things. I'm just, I wish I could go with you into Scotland there for a while, but I think my wife would kill me. But, it's all these
whenever you come over, we'll organize.
Yeah, likewise. Next time you head to Yosemite, give me a shout. But no, I've got a couple of pages of notes I want to go think about and research and stuff. So super thought provoking.
Wonderful. What a great experience. Thanks, Joe. Thanks, Mike, for being part of it, and everyone else for joining us tonight.
And yeah, we should, and I'm sure Mike and I will want to give you a big thanks, Gary, for inviting everybody and making it happen. It's a big experiment, and I hope everybody enjoyed it. It was great fun. I mean, I felt like I really just had a great time. So I hope that was okay.
Yeah.
And thanks for your great questions too. I really
Indeed.
appreciate it. Thank you.
Thanks again. Good night, everyone.
Cheers.
Take care.
Thank you.